Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today. I'm Jay Parsons, a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and the operational leader for research in the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Today is part of our center's weekly webinar series, which happens most Thursdays at noon Central Time. A full schedule is available on our website at cap.unl.edu. And you see us on your screen now, you see a slide with our upcoming schedule. And we also have recordings of past webinars up on that website. So that's cap.unl.edu. In today's webinar, we are going to look at cover crops, soil health, and financial incentives. The use of cover crops on U.S. cropland increased by 50% between 2012 and 2017, according to the Census of Agriculture. Today's webinar will look at how farmers are using cover crops, what types of federal and state incentives are available for their use, the soil health benefits, and farm financial outcomes associated with cover crops. To discuss these timely and important issues, we're glad to be joined today by Maria Bowman, Economist and Conservation Liaison with USDA's Economic Research Service. Maria, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jay. I'm really happy to be here today to share with you all. I'll go ahead and share my screen and you can confirm that that's working. Let's see. All right, how's that?
Looks good.
Awesome. Thanks. As Jay said, I'm an economist and conservation liaison at USDA's Economic Research Service. And for those of you who might not be very familiar with ERS or what ERS does, ERS is a USDA research and federal statistical agency. So we do research much like ARS does, but at ERS, our mission is to anticipate trends and emerging issues in agriculture, food, and the environment in rural America. And we conduct high quality, objective economic research to inform and enhance public and private decision making. So really trying to tell the stories of American farmers through data. We do research on a broad range of economic and policy topics. So if you're interested, you can visit our website, but we look at everything from global markets and trade to food safety and nutrition, agriculture and the rural economy. And then I work on conservation resources and environment topics, which is where this work fits. So today I'm going to focus on some findings from a new report that we released in February this year. It talks a lot about cover crop trends, programs, and practices in the US with a national focus. And I'll sprinkle some statistics in there related to Nebraska and some things that you all might be interested in about Nebraska focused programs. And then I'll also talk a little bit about some research that I conducted previously. I used to be at the Soil Health Partnership of the National Corn Growers Association. And the Soil Health Partnership was a program that worked with between 100 and 200 farmers between 2014, 2015, and this year. And we're collecting data on soil health indicators, looking at soil health management practices on actual working farms, including some farms in Kansas and Nebraska. So I'm going to jump right in. I think Jay is going to take a look at the questions as I'm going and maybe interrupt me if there are some clarification questions, but I'll be planning to leave time for questions at the end so we can have a little bit of a discussion. So again, this report that we published in February answers some basic questions about cover crops using federal survey data. And Stephen Wallander, a colleague of mine, was the lead on this report. And data in this report were taken primarily from the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, which is a survey that ERS conducts jointly with NASS, the National Ag Statistics Service. And ARMS, you might be familiar with, collects very detailed information on practices, especially at the field level, to get at some of those costs of production, as well as what types of conservation practices farmers are engaging in. And for a long time, we just weren't picking up too many farmers that were cover cropping in those surveys. But as cover crop adoption grew over time and as it was becoming increasingly of interest to our stakeholders and the folks that we serve, we realized it was a good time to try and dig into those data a little bit more to see if we could talk about what cover crops folks were growing, where cover crop adoption was happening nationally, how people were terminating them, and just describing some of those practices at a national level. So that's what we did. We also dug into some of the federal and state programs that provide financial assistance for cover crops and the role that those programs have played in stimulating cover crop adoption. So I probably don't need to tell you all this. Cover crop adoption is increasing across the US. So between the 2012 and the 2017 ag censuses, it grew by about 50%, from about 10 million acres to 15 million acres. But adoption is still relatively low, about 5% of cropland acres. And comparing that to conservation tillage or no-till, that's happening on 40% of acres. But for the first time, there are now more cover crop acres than spring wheat, cotton, or sorghum. So if you want to think about it in terms of the land base relative to some of those other crops that are being grown. And there's a lot of variability in where cover crop adoption happens across the United States, right? You can see that cover crop adoption is really high on the eastern seaboard, like where I am in Maryland. A lot of cover crop use in Pennsylvania and Virginia. We'll talk in a little bit about some of the policy factors that are driving that. There are also a lot of climatic and soil factors that contribute to this, as you all well know. So for example, in the southeastern United States, it's just a lot warmer. It's a lot easier to get that cover crop established with that longer growing window, not quite so many constraints around weather. So if we look at Nebraska specifically in those census data, I pulled a couple statistics out in preparation for this. So if we look at the percent of farms that are cover cropping, that's increased from about 8% of farms with some cover crops in 2012 to about 13% of farms in 2017. Acreage still relatively small, but it grew from around 2% in 2012 to closer to 4% in 2017. So relatively low, but quite a lot of growth. And again, no surprise to you all, but cover crops are relatively more common in central eastern parts of Nebraska. That's, I think, primarily due to moisture availability, some of those challenges with establishment around that precipitation gradient east-west across the state. So if we look at it by crop across the nation, we're able to see some interesting things happening here. So you can see again that adoption is growing over time. And each of those little bars, each of those little lines with 4 dots on them represents one survey. So we survey farmers in the year of that last dot, and then we ask them for what they did in the previous 4 years prior to that survey. So we get basically a 4-year history of whether they had cover crops on that field. And you can see that the rates of adoption are highest for corn silage fields. They're also pretty high for cotton. I was running some numbers on cotton last week for our most recent cotton survey, and they've gone up in that survey as well. But corn for silage is a really interesting, a really interesting trend that we're seeing here. And this kind of ties into some work that we're actually doing with Jay and others at University of Nebraska Lincoln right now, looking at some of the opportunities to integrate cover crops and livestock systems, right? So I think there are a couple of reasons we're seeing higher cover crop adoption on corn for silage fields. One is that corn for silage is typically grown on dairy operations or operations that are feeding that silage to livestock, right? So there's that immediate forage benefit associated with the cover crop that changes the economics. The other reason is that corn for silage is harvested earlier, so there's a longer planting window where folks have time to get the cover crop established after harvest. And there are resource concerns on those fields sometimes, right? So you're taking a lot of the residue off when you harvest the silage. There's also that additional soil cover benefit for the cover crop. And in the mid-Atlantic, where a lot of the dairy farms are, Pennsylvania, New York, there's added pressure on dairy farmers and others due to some of those Chesapeake Bay watershed considerations too. So if we look at the types of cover crops that we saw showing up in the survey, one of the things that we learned over time as we were doing the survey is that we needed to mess with the categories a little bit to let people report some different categories of cover crops. We're still working on this, but you'll see that for a while, the predominant categories were winter wheat and rye. So that rye likely combines cereal rye and annual ryegrass. And then we had a pretty high proportion of oats for corn silage in 2016. And then a lot of stuff that's falling into that other bucket. So some of those brassicas, radishes, other things. Clover is going in that clover, grass, and hay category. And then in the soybean survey in 2018, we allowed folks to report a mix. So we don't know what's in that mix, but we know that more than 20% of acreage in the 2018 soybean survey had a mix planted on it. So that's something that we'll be able to do a little better tracking of over time now that we've included that as an option. Termination method. No surprise, most people are burning down their cover crops. So especially for people who are in a no-till system, burning down that cover crop sometimes doesn't look so different from what they might have been doing otherwise to manage their fields in the spring. Tilling it in, also reported by a relatively high share of acres. And then we actually see quite a bit of harvesting. So again, in 2018, that was the first year that we started asking about whether folks harvested for grain or harvested for forage. And you might think, well, harvesting for grain, how is that a cover crop? This is something that's kind of tricky. How do you define a cover crop? In part because the policy definitions have been changing over time. In our survey, we just asked the farmer how they terminated it and whether it was a cover crop. So you're picking up some people in states that might have a commodity cover crop program or might have historically paid for harvested cover crops or double cropping. So there's a little bit of that built in here too. But interestingly, in that 2018 soybean survey, we are able to see that a not small proportion of farmers were harvesting for forage. So again, getting some more information about how many farmers are able to capitalize on that forage benefit of the cover crop. We were also able to look again with that crop history table with information about how many times farmers were using cover crops over the last 4 years. We were able to look at how often by crop they were using a cover crop. So again, cover crop adoption is growing over time, but if acres with the cover crop planted at least one of the 4 years, that was 16% of the 2015 cotton acres, 27% of 2016 corn silage acres, 53% of 2016 corn for grain acres, and 52% of soybean acres planted a cover crop. For all 4 years, that varies across crops. We had 52% of 2015 cotton, 42% of 2016 corn silage, and 11% of 2016 corn for grain. So again, this is something that we'll see changing over time as farmers are working more with cover crops and getting more experience. But I think it's important to tell this as part of the story because farmers are making decisions on an annual basis, and that cover crop might be associated with their crop rotation. So being able to add some more color to that story about how farmers are using cover crops in the context of their rotations is something that we are hoping to do in the future as well. So I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about some of the federal and state programs that are available to pay for cover crops. So I think, you know, as more and more farmers have been adopting cover crops, there has been more research to look at, you know, what the net return is to cover crops. And there's been research that has findings all over the map. And some of you have probably seen that. So Alejandro Plastina at Iowa State has largely been publishing research that there's a negative net return to cover crops. There's been some research recently out of the Soil Health Institute that focuses on cover crop adopters that have been working with cover crops for a long time that shows a positive net return. Some research out of Illinois that's also talking about it as negative. And a lot of this varies according to the assumptions that people are making and how they conduct their surveys. But I think the important message that I want to put forward is that some of these federal and state programs have really been key in terms of advancing adoption of cover crops and fueling some of that expansion that we've seen between 2012 and the present. So at the federal level, there are a couple of NRCS programs, a couple of NRCS working lands programs that are really important. You all are probably aware of these. The Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, is the primary one that's paid for cover crops historically, either a single species or a mix. And in 2018, there were about 2.4 million acres of cover crops planted with EQIP payments. And those payments are typically large payments, relatively large payments compared to what we see in most of the federal and state programs. The median per acre payment ranged from around $62 an acre in Illinois to $92 an acre in Delaware in fiscal 2017. CSP, which is a program that focuses more on maintaining and enhancing existing conservation activities on the farm. It's sort of a follow-on to EQIP in many cases for farmers, has lower payments for cover crops if you think about it on a per acre basis. So the median per acre payment attached to cover crops ranged from around $8 per acre to, you know, a little over $14.50 an acre in 2017. But again, about 2 million acres being covered by that program, and probably more if we were to look at the more recent data. And there's a lot of federal money that's gone into cover crops through those programs as well. A couple of other types of federal programs that are becoming available. So there are a few states, you've probably heard about these crop insurance premium discounts. They're typically $5 an acre. I believe right now there are crop insurance premium discounts available to folks that are cover cropping in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. And then in this year, we also saw something really interesting happen at the federal level that you all might have participated in or heard about. And that's the Risk Management Agency's 2021 Pandemic Cover Crop Program. And that was, again, that was a $5 per acre crop insurance premium discount to anyone who planted a cover crop and documented it on their 578 form. So we're really looking forward to taking a look at the data from this and seeing how this impacted cover cropping and how it might impact cover cropping next year. We don't know what will happen in the future at the federal level or whether this will continue since it is part of the Pandemic Assistance for Producers initiative. But again, another federal incentive for cover crops this year. At the state level, there are a lot of states that offer funding for cover crops. Some of the biggest programs are in Maryland. So if you remember back to that map that I put up, in the state where I live, there has been a high level payment for cover crops for quite a while. A payment range of $30 to $75 an acre for cover cropping. And there's a lot of acres in Maryland in cover crops. You see it everywhere around here. Everybody's got a cover crop in. One thing that's been really interesting about that program is that they have tweaked, they have little bonuses. So every year they'll change some of the program requirements. They'll offer different add-ons. So they have a bonus, I think, for cereal rye. And then last year they actually added a bonus if you were willing to leave your cover crop out there through April and terminate it later. So they're constantly tweaking that program to try and figure out how to get the maximum environmental benefit for those cover crops that are out on the landscape. Iowa and Virginia, some other big ones. And then one of the interesting things about the Missouri program is that I believe that they're the only program that has actually required soil health testing as part of their cover crop program. So there was actually a soil health testing program that they implemented as part of that. So I did want to focus a little bit on some of the financial incentives for cover crops in Nebraska and just kind of let you all know what the level of those is currently and some interesting programs that are just starting up. So in fiscal 21, the EQIP payment rate in Nebraska was about $24 an acre for basic cover crops. And then for multiple species, it was around $33, $34 an acre. Some of those higher payment rates are around historically underserved producers. So that's why there's a range there. And then there's a slightly lower payment rate for winter kill cover crops in Nebraska down there at the bottom. For CSP, again, I mentioned that dollar amount is a little lower. It's about $7 to $8.50 an acre for cover crops through CSP in fiscal 21. And then there's an additional practice standard for what's called cover crop adaptive management. And that, as far as I can tell, that's basically trialing a cover crop. So you're getting a field level payment to trial a cover crop or a soil health management system out there on that field, kind of similar to what we were doing at Soil Health Partnership, and you're getting a payment from NRCS to do that. So that's another interesting cover crop program that's available in Nebraska. So a third NRCS program that has a couple of projects, one that's been around for a while and one that's new, that are in Nebraska. So these are regional conservation partnership programs that are part of the NRCS suite of programs, but they're typically implemented through, again, regional partners, as the name says. So the first one I've listed here is a new one called the Nebraska Soil Carbon Project. And it's a collaboration between the Natural Resource Districts, NRCS, Nature Conservancy, Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, and several private companies. So Cargill, Target, McDonald's. And the program's managed by the Nature Conservancy, but there's going to be quite a lot of money doled out through this program. And the payment around that program will be around $45 an acre per year for cover crops. The other program that I wanted to highlight is called Cropland Cover for Soil Health and Wildlife. That's focused on Southwest and South Central Nebraska. And the goal there is to plant 7,000 acres of multi-species cover crops for a combined benefit of grazing and wildlife cover. So again, trying to get at this grazing benefit, but also provide some ecosystem services at the same time. And I did check in with NRCS before I gave this presentation, and they said that for both of these, applications are being accepted continuously this fall, but that there will be a cutoff date at some point. So if anybody wants to follow up after this, if you don't know who to follow up with, feel free to drop me a line and I can put you in touch. I'm going to talk a little bit, dig in a little bit on the financial side of things and just acknowledge some of the barriers of adoption to cover crops. Again, things that are probably familiar to you all if you're a farmer and you've thought about cover cropping. One important one is that I think a lot of the benefits of cover crops, especially if you're thinking about changes in soil health over time, in my experience at Soil Health Partnership, it was tricky because a lot of those benefits were slow to show up. So changes in the soil might be slow. And there's a lot of mystery and missing information about what to expect maybe when you start working with a cover crop. So I know that some other challenges in Nebraska and elsewhere might be labor, figuring out who's going to plant that cover crop. I was emailing with a friend who works in Nebraska and Kansas and is a farmer, and he was saying that labor is a really big one right now. I think also payments, a lot of these payments around carbon markets or new types of payments that might be coming down the pike, it's hard to know how much those programs are going to be paid. So it can be hard to figure out what that net present value might be over 2 or 5 or 10 years. Even just figuring out what varieties to plant and what mixes, sometimes it can be hard with the existing science and information that's out there to dial that in. So typically, I think there's some experimentation that happens, and then it's really a learning process over the first several years of working with cover crops. And that was what we decided to talk about in a report that I put together with some colleagues at Environmental Defense Fund and the ag accounting firm Keiko ISOM when I was at Soil Health Partnership. So we worked with 7 farmers to dig into their finances and take a look at the impacts of cover crops and conservation tillage. And also to get into some of these time dimensions and see whether farmers that had been cover cropping longer had some different outcomes or maybe had some things to say on the economics. And one thing that I'd say the main thing I want to highlight from that report, this is a table of the farmers that we were working with and some of their different management practices around cover crops. And you can see that they all were working on different acreages, different mixes, they had different costs, and they were choosing different seeding methods, right? And even within the same seeding method, there was a wide range of how much they were spending. So for example, if you look at aerial seeding and contracting out aerial seeding of a cover crop, they were spending between $10 and $20 an acre. And some of that is just where you are and what's available in terms of those services. So a lot of variability. You can see in terms of the seed cost also, all over the map, and that a lot of things can affect that. Again, where you're sourcing it, who your seed dealer is, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute and how some folks are able to get that seed cost down. But one pattern that we did see was that we saw that some of those more experienced cover croppers, they were able to make the economics work over the long run. And a lot of that was cutting down on costs, both the costs of the cover crop, but also on this cost reduction overall across their whole system over time. And it's hard to say that that's due to the cover crop specifically, but I think it's part of this long-term investment in conservation and getting those input costs down over time that most of these farmers had as a goal when they set out on this process. So for soybeans, you can see in this graph, some of the experienced adopters of cover crops had some of the highest net returns in our study when we looked at their budgets. And I wanted to share one example of a farmer that we worked with and that we featured in the report that I thought really epitomized this idea of dialing things in over time and being able to cut costs. So this is Chris Gaesser of Gaesser Farms in Iowa. And he now drills almost 5,000 acres of cereal rye and has worked really hard to keep costs down in the management system. In fact, they didn't work with any of those federal programs, in part because they were trying to get this out across a large number of acres, and they didn't want to be constrained by practice restrictions necessarily. So they trialed they trialed several different cover crop species before they settled on cereal rye, working with annual ryegrass, but found it difficult to terminate, not very cold hardy. And cereal rye was more cost effective, overwintered well, and was easier to terminate. When we talked with him about some of the things he did to get his costs down, the couple of things he mentioned is that he actually shifted from aerial seeding, which he said resulted in pretty inconsistent establishment of that cover crop, to broadcasting and drilling the seed themselves. So I think they do a mix of broadcasting and drilling, but it allows them to get it out there themselves and save some money. And then finally, they were able to reduce costs by growing their own cover crop seed. And this was something that I heard from several farmers that were able to make it work economically, that they either sourced seed cheaply, or they were able to grow some of their own cover crop seed and get it down to that $5 to $10 an acre range for seed, which can really add up over 5,000 acres, for example. And he said, actually, I gave a webinar once and somebody said, well, what about the opportunity cost of the land that you're growing that cover crop seed on? And he said, well, okay, now that you mention it, actually, I typically target marginal acres that I might be transitioning into something else to grow that cover crop seed. So it's part of a long-term plan on the ground that I'm growing it on. And that's how I'm able to make that work in terms of having those, 100, 150 acres on that marginal ground. So. Last, I want to share a little bit about some work that we did actually looking at the soil health impact of cover crops at the Soil Health Partnership. And we had a very, very basic research question in the Soil Health Partnership trials, and that was to see whether there was an impact of cover crops on some of the Cornell soil health indicators. For those of you that are not familiar with the Soil Health Partnership Network, again, it was implemented by the National Corn Growers Association with support and funding from a number of different partners, including NRCS, Foundation for Food and Ag Research, Bayer, other corporate partners. And those trials first began in 2014, and there was rolling enrollment through the last year of the program. And the network covered about 16 states, but obviously, as you can see from the dots on this map, most of those sites were in the I states, or several of the I states, Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois. And farmers, as part of the Soil Health Partnership Network, were choosing what they were trialing. So they were taking a field on their operation, and then they were implementing a soil health practice or management system that they were planning on trying anyway. So for about 80% of farmers, that was cover crops. But they weren't all planting the same cover crop. This was not a controlled trial, except in the sense that they did have treatment and control strips across their field. So you can see up there in that panel on the right that's got a B on it. That's what a typical soil health partnership strip trial looked like. You'd have treatment strips that would be the cover crop, and then control strips. And then we were pulling soil nutrient samples at the dots within those strips. And then we were also generating a soil health composite sample over those strips as well. What types of soil health indicators? So I don't know how familiar you all are with soil health indicators. There are a couple of different tests that folks have used historically, the Haney test, Cornell test, lots of different soil health management assessment frameworks. But we focused in this particular paper, we focused on the 6 Cornell indicators that are sort of part of their comprehensive assessment of soil health. So we were looking at ACE soil protein, which is sort of an indicator of available nitrogen. That's the way it's typically used. Active carbon, so a fraction of the carbon that's in the soil that's readily available to microbes. Aggregate stability. So we typically talk about that as the soil's resistant to a rain event. And actually they use a rainfall simulator at Cornell to measure that, where they have it rain on the soil and then see what happens to the soil. Organic matter, kind of a standard soil health indicator. Respiration measures microbial activity in the soil, and water holding capacity, which gets at, basically how much water that soil can soak up. And these tests were performed on composite soil samples over those strips, so 1 sample per strip, and they were collected every other year. So typically we'd collect a sample from the farm in the first year of the program, and then every other year thereafter. And what we saw was some indication that several of the indicators were increasing with cover crops. So in particular for these 4 indicators on this slide, we saw some evidence that they were changing with cover crops. Active carbon, again, the part of the carbon that's available for microbes. It's kind of a quicker changing. Folks, they like to think of it as a faster cycling or faster changing relative to soil organic matter. So while you might not be picking up changes in soil organic matter, maybe you're seeing those changes in active carbon. Aggregate stability, also some suggestion that that's changing within the first 3 to 5 years, and respiration and soil organic matter. We did not see strong results for water holding capacity or ACE soil protein. And while at first glance that might seem a little odd, since water holding capacity and available water are typically talked about as a soil health benefit of cover crops, but it's actually really not that strange given the way water holding capacity is measured in the lab. Water holding capacity is not the same thing as in-field infiltration, in part because the soil goes to the lab, it gets ground up, and then you perform the water holding capacity test on it, right? So it's largely dependent on soil texture and doesn't take into account how the soil is functioning in the field typically. Infiltration in that soil in the field might be a better measure of how that's changing. We were really excited about these findings. I think that there's a lot more work to be done on understanding the relationship between soil health indicators and agronomic outcomes, and also thinking about how to track some of these indicators and that soil function, again, outside of the lab. Because I think if there was one thing I learned managing that research program at SHP over the last few years, it was that it's really, really expensive to pull soil samples. And it's really, really hard to figure out if a change you're seeing is a real change, in part because some of these indicators vary a lot with cropping rotation. They can vary with weather and residue and other things. And so figuring out whether that trend that you're seeing between your first 2 samples is something that's going to persist over time can be really, really challenging. So I'll close just by talking a little bit about some of the ongoing research we have at cover crops at ERS. So one exciting project that we're working on right now that's led by Sophia Tanner is we're going to do some survey work to try and understand how farmer experience with cover crops changes incentives. So we know that farmers that have been working with cover crops longer might have figured some things out, or they might require lower incentive payments to continue working with cover crops. And so we're going to present some of this to them in a choice experiment and a survey to basically ask them, you know, how much would you need to be paid in order to continue cover cropping? If you're not cover cropping right now, what type of a financial incentive payment would be most attractive to you and under what situation? Some other areas that we're working on, again, role of federal programs in incentivizing cover crop adoption and how those are working. And then the impact of cover crops on yield, yield risk, cost, and profitability. So I think we still have a lot of work to do here. I talked earlier about how there are a lot of programs now for cover crop premium insurance discounts, but I think we still have a lot to understand about the potential impact of cover crops on yield or yield variability, and then how that relates to extreme weather conditions under climate change. You know, we posit that these practices are risk reducing, and I think that has certainly been some farmers' experience, but I think it's up to us to look at some of these federal data and see if that's actually what we're observing over time. So we're excited to get more into that over the next several years. And as I said, if anyone has questions related to anything I presented or wants to reach out to me with questions about this presentation, my email's down here. Feel free to drop me a line. I try to be good about getting back on emails, and feel free to pester me if I'm not. So.
Okay, thank you. Once again, you guys could type any questions that you have into the Q&A box or the chat box, either one. I'll monitor those and ask them as many as I can with the time that we have here at least. So one question on the crop that you early on you had the different crops and then the cover crop choices after it. Is there looking at the different crop rotations then? In other words, some of those data, I assume the way you had those data was the cover crop following that corn silage and cover crop following soybeans.
So it was actually before.
Oh, it's before. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So typically when we talk about the cover crop, we're talking about the cover crop preceding the crop. But we haven't looked a lot at the rotations and what cover crops we're seeing in the rotations. Again, I think as we get more and more cover croppers showing up in the survey data and do some surveys specific to cover crops, we'll have more power to be able to look at those rotations and cover crop choices, in a corn soybean rotation, for example. Okay.
And then the other question is on you alluded to kind of the definition of cover crops is a little fluid. And is there thoughts on how, because we've taken to, for example, here at UNL, we've taken to talk about them as cover crop forage sometimes, and adding on things where they're not just a pure cover crop. Is there question or thoughts or comments on any definitional things that you see in the pipeline, how people are going to talk about cover crops, whether they're an incentive program or just how USDA speaks about them, especially with the alternative uses of them?
Yeah, I want to be careful because I know that's something that's always changing, and USDA has been working really hard on harmonizing their definitions. But at least according to my understanding, NRCS and RMA and FSA have decided that effectively harvesting the cover crop for forage and on-farm use meets the definition of a cover crop. And I think that that's true right now across NRCS programs and RMA and FSA. The challenge is that there are also good farming practice guidelines and termination practice guidelines that make all of that more complicated, right? So it's not just about how the cover crop's being used, it's also about when it's being planted and when it's being terminated, and whether that meets restrictions associated with crop insurance, and also practice standards if you're participating in an NRCS program. So it'd be hard for me to talk about all of those permutations and get it right, but I will say that USDA has made some leaps and bounds over the last few years trying to be consistent across programs and how they treat cover crops.
Okay, good. And in the last study that you had with the strips and the soil testing, fairly extensive soil testing going on there, question came in on soil health test results. They've been this particular listener's been waiting over a year for their test results. And their question is, they don't know what the delay is, but just in general, the delay on seeing the soil health benefits from cover crops. It looks like you got to pretty much look 2, 3, 4, 5 years out before you're going to see them. Is that been
I think
consistent?
That's true. Yeah, and in general, one of the challenges that we ran into as we were trying to run more and more soil health samples when we were at Soil Health Partnership was just lab capacity. And in particular during the pandemic, like we didn't sample during that early pandemic year because we weren't sure what was going to happen with coronavirus and people being out in the field. We had field managers that were going out. And so we actually canceled sampling that year, and a number of the university labs didn't process samples for a while because they were also closed. So a lot of it had to do with supply and demand, and a lot of those soils labs just being closed due to the pandemic or having constraints on labor like everybody else has right now. So I think that might be what's happening for that person who's experiencing that delay, unfortunately.
Okay. So do you have a recommendation then that perhaps maybe the first year isn't a good return on soil sampling? In other words, if they have a baseline, should they be testing every year soils?
Oh, I think that's something that's really important to talk with your agronomist about, or your crop advisor. It depends a little bit on what your goals are or what particular indicators you're interested in seeing changes in. I do think it's important to get a baseline sample. It might not be important to sample every other year. I think what we were seeing was, every 3 years, every 4 years might be enough. But also there's a lot of variability, as I said, in some of those conditions. So I think it's going to take some trial and error as more and more farmers are testing to figure out what that correct interval is, much as I think it's taken a while to figure out for people who are grid sampling for nutrients, how often they should be doing that on their farm.
Okay, and then a question on the incentive programs. Do the federal incentives provide a break even for cover crop costs, realizing that there's a lot of hidden economic returns that are hard to pin down? Do those incentive programs basically look at covering the cost of purchasing, seeding, and chemical killing costs? Is that?
So my understanding is that the way those payment rates are calculating takes all of that into consideration, but I don't know that it's necessarily set up as a break-even point. They do have, NRCS does have several cover crop economics calculators available that are regionalized, and you can plug in the specifics of your seed or your seed cost to take a look at what that break-even point might look like. So that's certainly something I could share resources on if folks wanted to follow up. But I think, to some extent, federal programs are also taking into account that there is some risk and some other issues at play here, knowing that we don't fully understand the economics of cover crops. So they're trying to get people past those first few years as they're figuring things out and learning as well.
Okay. And then looking at that data within those, you had 2012 and 2017 data, and your map with where cover crops are being utilized and stuff. Is there a place that in the country that's you see a lot of potential for growth, or is it pretty much more? I mean, you had the percentages, and if I looked at the percentages correctly, Nebraska on a percentage basis actually exceeded the national average in terms of growth, but we're just working with such a low baseline.
Yeah, I don't want to speculate about that too much. I think that there are a lot of areas where there's potential for growth in cover crops, but I also think it's important that we're doing the research to figure out what types of cover crop mixes and management practices work in those regions. So a lot of constraints around cover cropping, again, related to weather and moisture. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in that next ag census, and as we continue to dig into the data to see, where it's becoming more popular and what some of those practices are that are working for folks.
Okay. Well, we'll wait a few minutes here. Oh, here we got another one that popped in. Appreciate all the work that you're doing and ERS is doing on conservation practice trends. Are there plans to get more data on cover crops and other diversification conservation practices in the next ag census and other surveys and satellite data from USDA?
Oh, we have lots of ideas and lots of plans. And we're continuing to try and figure out how to do a better job at tracking some of them. There is going to be a conservation practice and motivation survey that NRCS is working on that's going to be talking quite a bit about cover crops over the next couple of years. And we're also going to be doing this choice experiment with a large set of farmers, including a lot of farmers that have participated in the federal conservation programs. So, there's a possibility that we would add more questions or do more surveys as part of some of the federal surveys, but it's important to hear feedback from stakeholders about that kind of stuff as well. And so a lot of the reception that we've been getting on this cover crops report, I think, has helped fuel the idea that this is research that's really interesting to people, and that we should continue in that line. So
I know we have a lot of interest in it here in Nebraska, and we really appreciate our partnership with you and your willingness to work with us on some of these questions. Wait just a minute or so and see if any last minute questions come in, but is there anything burning from you that you'd like to tell people that ERS would like to know from producers, or things that you'd like to hear from people?
Well, as I've we've been working on a couple of these projects this fall, trying to put some of the pieces together on soil health practices and management systems, because I think a lot of times when we look at statistics, we have a tendency to break them out into practices, right? We'll do a report on tillage, we'll do a report on cover crops, we'll do a report on nutrient management. And so I think one of the things we're trying to do a better job at is figuring out how those things fit together. So we've been doing some work on looking at resource concerns that farmers have and how that relates to conservation practice adoption. And then also just starting to think more about management systems, because at least in my experience, a lot of the farmers that were working with cover crops had to make a lot of changes to their nutrient management in order to address some of the concerns that they had around cash crop performance. And just in general, they had to pay more attention to that. So I think continuing to provide us with information for those of you who are cover cropping about how your management practices are working for you, and having patience with us as we continue to dig through the data and work on, what are we seeing across the nation. It's really important to do the work, and sometimes it takes a little while to tease out those trends. So.
Thank you. Yeah, that's good to hear from you, because I mean, as we've talked, this is several years, it's a strategy, right? I mean, when you implement something like these and people This day and age, people aren't the most patient. We want to see results right away.
Answers right away. Yep.
Yeah, sometimes these things take time. Well, really appreciate your presentation today, and it looks like we're out of the questions, so you survived that. Nothing too bad for you, huh? And yeah, thanks for the great information. So thanks everyone for joining us today. A recording of the webinar will be posted on our website at cap.unl.edu. And you can also go there to register for any of our upcoming webinars that the Center for Agricultural Profitability puts on. Next week, we actually have 2 webinars taking place, and they'll be covering the meat processing industry. On Tuesday, we're going to have one that'll look at the financial and legal issues associated with developing a meat processing plant. And then on Thursday's webinar, we'll look at grant opportunities available for new and existing processors. So we ask as you, before you get off today, that you click the link available that's in our chat box right now and take a brief 3-question survey to provide feedback on this webinar and also help us inform our upcoming webinars. If you have any topic or speaker ideas, we'd really be glad to hear about those. So thanks again, Maria, for a great presentation, and thanks for all the people that joined us today and those that submitted questions. We really appreciate it and wish everybody a pleasant day.
Thanks for having me.